you everybody for attending. It's great to be here today. So maybe some of you attended 4 years ago a talk I was giving here. It was a wake-up call for SATCOM Security, and we presented a lot of different vulnerabilities, backdoors in satellite communication terminals, and we elaborated some theoretical scenarios about the problems that are located or are derived from these products. So, that research was not exempt from polemic because some people thought it was impossible or it was extreme, the worst case scenario. So, in this research in 2018, I'm going to demonstrate that with 3 real-world examples that what we presented in 2014 was actually real. This is a little bit weird, but we are going to start with the conclusions in order to avoid any potential misunderstanding, because this is a very sensitive topic. So, this research is mainly focused on 3 different sectors: the aviation, the maritime, and the military. For each of them, we have different metrics. And we are talking about a security risk if there is any problem with the communications or the usual security issues we are used to see. Then we have the flight safety risk. So this means that is there any real situation or a problem that can be put it at risk, the safety of the people or the aircraft? And then we have the radio frequency risk, because we are presenting, we are introducing the radio frequency attacks using compromised SATCOM equipment. So this has to be taken into account. And then we have the likelihood and the attack vector, which, it's obvious. So it's important to note, for the aviation sector, there is no safety risk. We'll explain later why this is the case. For the maritime sector, obviously there is no flight safety risk, but we have a radio frequency risk that it may have safety implications. So that's important. And then for the military, there is no radio frequency risk, at least as far as I know. And obviously there are security risks for all the sectors. This research is also about the traditional concept of hacking I have in my mind. It's when you don't have access to a system, but you really want to know everything about that system. So this is how I did it, and that's the talk. So the conclusions for the 3 different sectors, and an additional one which might be impacted by these problems, the space one, is the following. We have different threats for each section. For the aviation, we have the ability to disrupt, intercept, or modify non-safety. This is important, non-safety, because we can control, we can manipulate the in-flight Wi-Fi, the internet connectivity that is used by the crew and the passengers, but the safety communications are using a different communication channel. So this is important to note. We have the ability to attack the crew and passengers' devices. We have also the ability to manipulate the SATCOM antenna positioning and the transmissions. For the maritime, it's pretty much the same, but in addition to this, we have the ability to perform cyber-physical attacks using the radio frequency that we can control from the antenna. For the military, the concept of safety may be a little bit different if we can pinpoint the location of a military base or military units. Then they might put at risk those bases or units. And for the space, as we control as we are going to see hundreds of these satellite communication terminals, it is possible to perform an attack, mainly a disruption attack against a satellite transponder. So that's the conclusions. And then we go to the content. It all started in November 2017. I took a flight from Madrid to Copenhagen. It was basically in Norwegian, which is well known for offering free Wi-Fi in flight. So, well, I mean, I just ran Wireshark to see what was going on. And there were some weird things. First of all, the internal IP got assigned was a public IP. It was a routable IP. Well, it may happen, but that was a little bit weird. But then, after some time, I noticed that I was receiving some random scans from the internet on my computer, and it was like, something is really wrong here, for sure. So basically, once on the ground, I decided to take a look at the IP ranges of those public IPs I noticed. And what I found was there were hundreds of satellite routers from Hughes. And one thing to note is that when you access those routers, the latency is higher than for terrestrial networks. So that's clearly was showing that we were accessing those devices from a satellite link. So at that point, it was like, okay, something is wrong. But before moving further into the investigation, I decided to collect everything I could, read everything I could in order to understand how the system was working, because I didn't want to mess in the wrong way with an in-flight aircraft. So that's important. And unfortunately for us, there are a lot of different sources to get information, because there are a lot of regulations involved. So when vendors want to get an approval to operate this kind of equipment, they have to send some documents that usually are available at the FCC website. So there are a lot of different documents that are really interesting. Also YouTube videos and everything. So I decided to try my luck and see if Shodan was able to capture some of those in-flight aircraft. And actually, that was the case. So I think that, John, if you are over here, you have to add airplanes to Shodan, because that was very useful for me. Basically, what we could test, and I was able to verify that the fleets from the Southwest airline, Norwegian and Icelander, were exposed to the internet, and it was possible to access all those aircraft. Obviously, some of them were, when they are not flying, this system is not operating, so you can't access at certain times. So, how this system works? So, there is a standard, the ARINC 791, which is intended for the KU, KEI band earth stations. And according to this standard, we can identify the different components of the system. We have the modem, which was the device that was actually exposed to the internet. And it's a control device, but it's built on top of a Hughes HX200. We have the antenna control unit, which comes from a product from Tecon, the QStream 1000. We have the SMU, the server management unit, which is an airborne server which controls some core functionalities, and it also has some other interfaces we'll see later. And finally, the satellite antenna assembly and the high-power transceiver, they both come from the same product, the QStream 1000. You can see some pictures here. On the left, we have the server management unit, which is basically a Linux system, and it's the airborne server which hosts the in-flight portal. So this is exposed to the passengers. If you access to the in-flight Wi-Fi, you can access the in-flight portal, and that's located on the SMU, which is also an attack vector. It also has the 3G functionality to receive updates and remote control once the aircraft is on the ground. And then we have the MDU, which is actually the device that was exposed. So this is basically a VxWorks device with different services. We have the common ones: Telnet, FTP, web server, SNMP, but then we also have some proprietary services that I reverse engineered, and we will see later. So we have seen the SMU and the MDU, but if you remember, there were another three components: the high power transceiver, the antenna control unit, and the antenna. So if you can see here, between the antenna control unit and the high power transceiver, there are a couple of interfaces that are interesting for us. There is a discrete signal, and then we have Ethernet. So this is important because they are accepting command and control commands from the Ethernet interface. So, okay, I could access the web server for the MDU, but I wanted to get the firmware as usual. So I wanted to analyze the firmware. So the way to get the firmware was basically I read some documentations, and I noticed an interesting functionality, which is the fallback updater. So it's important to note that in 2014 I discovered several backdoors in Hugh's product. So when I saw that this product was also from Hughes, it was suspicious. So the fallback updater basically allows you to deploy a new firmware to the unit without asking for any password or something like that. So it's like, oh, something is wrong here. And effectively, and that's right, there was a backdoor, the Swordfish backdoor. Basically, this is the code from the fallback updater. It tries to connect to the VxWorks shell, and it sends the user and the password. You can see both of them, and that's it. You are in. So, well, I had to try this on the real MDU from an in-flight aircraft, and well, it worked. So we had a VxWorks shell at 30,000 feet in an in-flight aircraft from the ground through the internet. If you know a little bit about VxWorks, once you have access to the cell, you can basically read memory, write memory, execute arbitrary code, and it's over. So, but I wanted to really get the firmware that was running inside the MDU, because I got the fallback updater, which was similar but not exact the same. So that's located in that directory. We can access that through the FTP server, and it's basically a MIPS image with the full VxWorks symbol table compiled intact. So I just created an IDA script to rebuild the symbol table, and it's very useful because it's a complex firmware. So having all the names of the functions is really interesting for us. So we have access to the system. What now? What can we do? So this is the post-exploitation phase. So first of all, we need persistence, because several reasons, but if we are going to perform an attack where the antenna is moving and losing the lock to the satellite, then it's over. There is just there is no connection anymore to our command and control server or whatever. So by gaining persistence, we can deploy automatic payloads to the MDU. And we also have to control the non-safety communications if we want to look for what's going on in the network, if we want to inject malicious payloads for passengers or crew, something like that. We want also to isolate the satellite terminal from the network operation center, because as you see in the picture, the NOC is controlling everything, including our satellite terminal, and we don't want that. We don't want that because the NOC can remotely disable the transmission, for example, and we want to operate the satellite terminal on our own and completely isolate it from the NOC. And finally, we want to turn the terminal into a malicious intentional radiator. What's this? Okay, so an intentional radiator is basically a device that generates and emits a radio frequency. And there is an implicit rule with these devices, which is basically if there is no log, if you don't receive the carrier from the satellite, then you don't have to transmit, because you can have a lot of problems if you transmit. You can mess with the wrong satellite, or with people, or with material. So it's not a good idea to transmit without having the proper carrier locked. So our idea is to actually perform that. We want a malicious intentional radiator where we don't care if there is lock or not. We just want to transmit and transmit toward the direction we want. The firmware has a lot of functionalities, and it's really big and really interesting, but we are going to focus on the ones that are interesting for our scenario. So this is some of the functionalities I decided to analyze. Some of them can be used as an attack vector. Some of them are mostly interesting from the post-exploitation perspective. So that's it. Let's start with the authentication. Obviously, we found the Swarfish backdoor in the firmware. You can see how it is added to the login table in the VxWorks image. But then I found another backdoor, which was only for terminals that are operating under FIPS 140. Basically, there are some specific functionalities in the web server that can only be accessed if you have the proper credentials, which is basically crypto and officer. So it's not very complex. We also have the accelerators, which are very common in the satellite industry, because if you can save a byte, then you save money, you save performance, you save a lot of different things. So this is useful as an attack vector, because basically in this terminal there are a couple of them implemented. The turbo page, basically when you ask for a website. It goes through a proxy that is on the ground, and they are using some compression algorithm, and they are returning the context. So by identifying the functions that are involved in this functionality, we can inject our own payloads, we can modify the traffic, that kind of things. Obviously, if there is a strong end-to-end encryption, then it's another problem. Then there is an interesting feature. In this case, it wasn't present in the aircraft from the airlines affected, but it was already implemented in the MDU. This is automatic beam switching, which is used to connect to different satellite beams according to the real-time position of the terminal. The maps that are locally stored in the MDU, which is the modem, And in order to perform this kind of functionality, the modem commands the antenna control unit to control when to change between beams. And this is interesting for us because we can demonstrate in this way that if you compromise the modem, you can, in certain cases, not in this one, but in certain cases, you can command an arbitrary ACU to perform some actions. In this case, we are talking about an ACU from orbit, and as you can see in the code, it was possible to mute or unmute the block-up converter, which is very interesting from the malicious intentional radiator perspective. Also, what about isolating the terminal from the NOC? Well, as you can see, the NOC is able to control the transmit power the satellite terminal needs, because it's. I think we can simplify the functioning of a satellite terminal. It's like a silly device. It can perform complex tasks, but someone needs to tell how to perform those tasks. So the NOC is telling the terminal, okay, use this power, use this modulation scheme, this coding, that kind of things. So we want to isolate the terminal to avoid this kind of things. So I reverse engineered the protocols used between the huge NOC and the terminal, and there were several protocols, some of them more interesting than others, but this one is interesting because it allows to remotely disable the transmission from the terminal from the NOC. So basically, if the NOC detects something wrong with the terminal, it just can disable the transmission. But we don't want that because we don't want to stop the transmission. So you can see that, for example, the enable disable transmit is just implemented as a flag. So they are if the terminal receives this packet from the NOC, it sets a flag, and then in other functions in the firmware, they check whether that flag is active, and if so, they disable the transmission or they enable the transmission. Obviously, we can patch this, we can control whether the transmission is enabled or not. And there are other proprietary services in the network services section. For example, if we read the patent, or not the patent, but the licensing form that Global Eagle sent to the FCC to get approval to operate satellite terminals, we can see how the antenna pointing is complemented, or it's implemented. So it's interesting because the antenna control unit is requesting data from the MDU, which is something we control, and they are requesting SNO from the MDU to see if everything is correct in terms of the receiving data. So I reverse engineered the firmware to discover where this implementation was located, and you can see that how they initialize the task, and they get the SNO samples from the demodulator that is located in the modem, and they send that data to the clients. And we have another interesting proprietary service, which is the host command. It's listening on the 2300 TCP, and it supports dozens of commands. You can perform different functions, remote control, crypto keys for transec and comsec implementations, maintenance, configuration, everything. And it's interesting because by looking at the active connections in the MDU, we can see that the antenna control unit at that IP and the server management unit both are connected to the info server and the host command server respectively. So we see that two things. We can control the data that they are receiving, so there is a window to send malicious data that is going to be parsed by the SMU and the ACU, and also that we are in the same network segment where the antenna control unit and the SMU are located, so we have access to that, to those devices. And we can verify this by issuing an internal DNS request in the in-flight Wi-Fi, and it's interesting to see that the domains that returned. So at that point, we had the whole picture of how that system worked. So we have the server management unit and the modem data unit. Everything is connected through the LAN with different segments, but still through the MDU we can reach other devices. There is also the wireless LAN unit. I didn't focus on that device, but if you are attending DEF CON, my friend and colleague that also works at IOActive is going to compromise the operating system that is running inside that device. So go for it. It's Josep, and it's Extreme Network. We know the operating system, so don't miss it. And it was also interesting because by looking at the active connections, I noticed there were random IPs trying to connect to the telnet service. So I decided to take a look to see if something was going on. And well, basically I decided to go for a specific IP, and it was an IoT botnet trying to log into the MDU from in an in-flight aircraft. So it was funny. Obviously, this botnet is not prepared to infect VxWorks machines. So fortunately, there was no risk for the aircraft. In terms of the military, I found military SATCOM equipment exposed to the internet, and these devices had a GPS device attached, so I could locate the position of those terminals. And I found that those were located in conflict zones, and unfortunately, this problem is still not completely fixed, I think. So we are not providing further details until we are sure that everything is correctly mitigated. And then we go to the maritime case. In this case, the target or the scope of this part was the Intellian products that you can see that they have a lot of different products for different satellite services like Global Express or Fleet Broadband, or this one is an Intellian antenna, but it's for VSAT. So that's the basic configuration of the antenna. We have obviously the antenna, and then we have the antenna control unit, which is the device that you can see here. There are different versions of the same antenna control unit. Some of them, the most modern ones, support Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, all the wireless connections you want to improve the user experience. But the underlying problem is that well, it's a mess. I tried to find the firmware in the main website. You need login, so I decided to Google to see if I could find something, and I found this. I mean, I didn't even leave this message. And okay, when I read this, it was like, I'm not sure about this. so effectively, I mean, as you may expect, it's a total mess. I mean, you have backdoors, you have insecure protocols, buffer overflows. It's a capture the flag, basically, firmware. So you can get root, I don't know, in hundreds of ways. So that's a problem. And I observed the same pattern, random IPs, but in this case it was worse because I decided to take a look at an antenna control unit that was exposed. There are dozens or hundreds of antenna control units exposed to the internet. And actually, in this case, it was already infected by the Mirai botnet. So basically, they were using an insecure password that is implemented in the antenna control unit. So basically, this means that everything we can say here about this can happen right now, because there are malware, and there is malware already infecting vessels. So let's see a demo. Basically the antenna control unit it's using a proprietary protocol to control the antenna, and well, it's you can reverse engineer this protocol from different sources using the antenna control unit binaries. Using a mobile application, they have to connect to the antenna control unit wirelessly. There are a lot of different ways, so it's not complicated. Okay, so we have a game here with a bunch of Nazis, which is always funny to kill some Nazis. So we can try to our luck and see if the antenna moves with our pointer, and we can kill some Nazis. That's it. It's safe. We are not transmitting, so no damage. Okay, so this basically means we can control the antenna. And then we move to the cyber-physical attacks, which is an interesting development in this research. So we are controlling an antenna. An antenna is just it's a way to expose or transmit radio frequency, which is electromagnetic energy in the end. So we have demonstrated we have the ability to transmit whenever we want, or to control the antenna positioning. So what can we do with this? So what happens with when the electromagnetic energy reaches a target, a point? Okay, so we have that the electric field is exerting a force on the charged particles. So this may happen that this may attract electrons or push away electrons, and when this happens, which is the quantum jump, then some photons are emitted or absorbed. So there is basically energy that is being transmitted. So this can cause a thermal effect on biological tissues, and this is something that has been demonstrated is the only adverse effect against biological tissues that has been demonstrated according to radio frequency. There are different scenarios after that, but that happens. It's scientifically demonstrated. So we can potentially harm people, or we can also create malfunctions in electronic or electrical systems, mainly by coupling. So as you can see in the picture, this has been known for years in the military industry. So when the vendor or when vendors want to receive an approval for the antennas, they have to fill some form, they have to present some documents with radio frequency hazard analysis, and this can be done in different ways. They can take the measurements from an antenna in an anechoic chamber, or they can simulate the measurements, and the FCC is providing all the approach to this. So basically, I decided to take that approach. So I took the equations from that FCC bulletin, I built a model to simulate the potential effects for the antennas to demonstrate if it was possible or not to perform a cyber physical attack, because all the levels that are the radio frequency levels you are exposed to are properly regulated, so you need to comply with those levels. So it's something I'll upload to the materials for this talk, but it's basically an Excel with the model implemented in it. So we have different parameters and we can model the antenna, and then we can get the far field, because we are focused on the far field. We don't really think there is a scenario where we can use the near field for the antenna. So as you can see, for this maritime antenna, which is pretty similar to this, there is a value that is higher than the regulatory level at the beginning of the far field. So what happens with this? Okay, so if you are a person that are exposed to this radio frequency beam, and you don't know you are exposed to that beam, there may be a problem for your safety, for your health. So let's talk about some scenarios in the maritime sector. Imagine a cruise ship, which is a real picture with a couple of intelligent antennas, and you can see there is an antenna here, and imagine that you can control the antenna and you can force the antenna to point toward the people that are here or here, because we can control the positioning of the antenna. And the antennas usually have some controls, software controls, to avoid these kind of scenarios. These are the blocking zones. So you can set up a blocking zone according to the azimuth and the elevation of the antenna in order to prevent these scenarios. But in this case, we managed to bypass that protection, and it is possible to use anything, any azimuth or elevation. So that's not working. Or you can also think in a cargo vessel. Imagine that the compromised antenna is located here, and you can illuminate the bridge. That's also problematic for people or instruments aboard. What about the aviation? Okay, we built the model as well, and for the far field power density at the beginning of the far field, there was also a regulatory level higher than higher than the maximum permitted. But again, in this case, it's difficult or it's impractical to find a scenario where this can lead to a safety risk. Let's put an example. This is a picture of the Atlanta airport. You can clearly identify some Southwest airplanes. Even you can identify the radome for the SATCOM antenna. So imagine that by any reason we have compromised those aircraft. We are able to transmit toward any direction. There is a regulatory minimum distance between aircraft. So at the minimum distance we can reach people or other aircraft. There is no risk for the safety of people or instruments, because we have to take into account that due to the nature of the aviation sector, they have been exposed to high intensity radiated fields for years, because they are in the path from the ground transmitters to the satellite. So they have developed the compensating controls, they have developed the proper mitigations, and to prevent any kind of problems with radio frequency attacks. So there is no risk, even if we consider that we have compromised hundreds of these antennas, and we are pointing at the same time against an aircraft. The regulatory level modern aircraft comply with is higher than the electric field strength we can achieve. So even we have to take into account that the aircraft are certified for levels that are usually higher than the uncertificate levels that are required. So according to our figures, according to the inputs we have received from the industry, from the aviation industry, we conclude that there is no safety risk for the aircraft. We can control non-safety communications, that kind of things, but we should be safe. I mean, there is no problem. I came here by plane, so it's no problem. And this has been one of the most complex scenarios we have faced in terms of disclosure. We reported this to different authorities and entities. Unfortunately, we were unable to contact Intellian, so all the issues we have been talking about in the maritime sector are still out there. Don't do anything wrong, because there are some important issues in this field, so don't do it. And special thanks for Peter Lemme from the ARINC 791 standard and to AISAC. And thank you very much for all the people that have been involved in this research from the logistic perspective, because it has been very, very complicated. So thank you very much to the workers of Black Hat, to my colleagues at the iActive Madrid lab. Thank you, everyone. So that's it. Thank you.